Good morning, everyone. We are in Masechta Masros, Perek Aleph Mishnah Beis, Chapter 1, Mishnah 2. Now, the previous Mishnah told us that anything that is edible, even before it's fully grown, and even though we wait for it to grow, typically we wait for it to grow larger, it's considered edible even at the early stages, and therefore at that stage, Truma and Meiser can be separated from it. That was by vegetables. By fruits, we say typically that as they start growing, they are not edible. They have to be grown in order for them to be edible, and therefore, that at that point you can take Trumas and Meisers from it. Now, the next Mishnah is going to be telling us, going through different examples of different fruits to know when is the point that they're considered edible, because it makes a very big difference in these halachas that we're studying. Now, it's also important to know, and this is something we had mentioned before, is that the whole discussion here about whether it is obligated, whether it's obligated in Trumas and Meisris at this point or not, is really dealing with the following, and that is that one is permitted to snack on the grains, on the food before it's fully processed. There's a whole processing that's done when we're talking about produce. At the completion of the processing, that is when the obligation of Truma and Meiser takes full effect, and you cannot eat from it at all. Before that point of time, which is the time that we're talking about right now when it becomes edible, but it's not fully processed, at that point you can snack on it, but you can't make a meal out of it. You can't eat it in a regular meal type way. If it's earlier than the point of being edible, you don't have to do anything. It doesn't make a difference what you do. You can decide to make a meal out of it. After it's inedible stuff, you're not going to have to separate Shumas and Meisers. But our discussion that we're having right now is that it's hit the stage of edibility. Once it's edible, you may still snack on it, but you can't eat it in a regular fashion, in a meal type fashion. At a certain point, which will be discussed further on in this chapter, when the processing is done, that's already the point that you can't even snack on them anymore. But right now, we're discussing the point where you can still snack, but you can't eat regularly from them. At what point of time do the fruits, meaning the fruits that don't start off edible, but eventually become edible, when are they liable for Meisris to say that I can only snack, but I cannot eat regularly from them? And now the Mishnah is going to go through examples. Hata'enim, we're talking about figs. Misha yavchilu. Yavchilu means for when they begin to ripen. And what that means is, the Bartenura explains, is that the tips of the figs turn white. Once the tips of the figs turn white, they're edible. They're not fully grown, but they're edible. Ha'anavim v'havashim. If we're talking about grapes and avashim, which is an inferior type of grape, bishav ishu, from the point of time that you can see the skin, you can see the seeds through the skin. Again, at an early age of ripening, it comes to a point that you can see the seeds through the skin. At that point, we already know that the grapes are going to be considered edible. And as the Bartenura says, all you need in this case, you have a cluster of grapes. All you need is one grape to come to this point where you can see the seeds through the skin. And then the rest of the grapes, even if you can't see them, they're also now going to be liable for Meisris, because once one of them has this sign, which means it's edible, that tells us the rest of them are also edible. So all you need is one grape to be this way. Ha'ug v'ha'tusim mishayadimu. They translate here ug as cornelian cherries, and tusim are mulberries. When they turn red, which I'm assuming means when they start to turn red, I'm not sure if it means they completely turn red or they start to turn red, but it says once they turn red, I think it means when they start turning red, that is when these fruits, the oig and the tusim, are considered edible. V'chol ha'adumim, and any red fruit, Mishiyadimu. It's considered edible once it turns red. Next, Harimayim Mishiyamasu. Pomegranates, become liable to Maisris. Once they become soft enough, you can crush the seeds with your fingers. And again, once you have one of them, even around a pomegranate, once there's one seed that way, then all the rest of the seeds, that shows us all the rest of the seeds are also edible. And therefore, this entire pomegranate has the obligation of Maisris on it. Hatamarim, dates, Mishiatilu Sa'ar. Mishiatilu Sa'ar means when they develop cracks like sourdough. And that means that a sourdough is a dough that has become very leavened. And as leavening increases, I'm reading here from the notes in the art scroll, the smooth surface of the dough begins to develop cracks. Well, something similar happens to a date as it develops. The date starts to have ridges in its skin, which are similar to the cracks on the surface of the sourdough. Those ridges are a sign that they are edible. Va'afarsikim are peaches. V'sheyatilu gidim. Once they start developing, gidim literally means sinews, red sinews. I mean, they start developing these red streaks in their skin. Once they start developing these red streaks, it's already considered edible. Ha'agoizim, walnuts, Mishayasim Megura, once they form a storehouse. What that means is like this. When we're dealing with a walnut, when a walnut starts growing, the kernel of the nut is attached to the outer shell. As it begins to ripen, the kernel separates from the shell and sits inside of it as if it is simply being stored there. That's what it means. The walnuts, Mishayasim Megura, once they make a storehouse. That means once they become detached from the outer shell, then that means that they are edible enough to say that they're that they're obligated in Maisris. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda says, when we're talking about egoizim mishkedim, walnuts and almonds, once they develop a thin shell. Now what that means is like this. In walnuts and almonds, a dark brown skin grows inside the nut around the lighter colored kernel. These are usually peeled off before the nuts are eaten. This is the point of time, according to Yehuda, when they are considered edible, which, as the Bartanura points out, only after, sounds like after the complete ripening of the nut, that is when they develop this skin, this peel, which again would be removed when you eat the nut. But once it comes to that point, according to Yehuda, that's when it's edible. Earlier than that is not. The sages say in even an earlier stage, once it becomes disconnected from the shell, it's considered edible. Yehuda says no. It needs to ripen more. It needs to ripen to the point where it develops the skin. At that point, that is when these nuts are already obligated in Shuma and Maaseh. Let's see the next Mishnah Gimel. Hecharuvin, if we're talking about carobs, Mishayina Kedu, when they start developing black spots. Now, a carob, typically, when it's fully grown, it's fully ripened. It's either completely black, or dark brown. The Gemara calls it black. It's dark brown, but it calls it black. So the point is that these carobs, when they're fully ripened, they're black. As they start ripening, they start developing black dots. That's the point that they're already considered edible and obligated in Maaseh. And any black fruit, any fruit that becomes, any dark fruit rather. Also, we say, any dark fruit, once starts developing those dots, the halacha is that it is now considered edible. Okay. Ha'agasim, which they translate here as pears, krustamulin, which the Bartanura calls it a type of an apple that resembles a golna. Vahaparishin, they translate as quinces. Vahuzradin, they translate that as sword apples. Okay, all these things, mishkayarechu, when they start developing bald spots, that means that when these fruits start to grow, they have a fuzz on them. They have a fuzzy surface, and as they start ripening, that fuzz starts falling off and developing these bald spots. So therefore, in these four cases, we say The way to know that it's already considered edible is when it starts developing the bald spots. Then the Mishnah says, V'chala lavanim, and any white fruit, which means any fruit that are light colored and not red or black, mishkerechu, work with these, with this idea of the bald spots. Once that fuzz starts falling off, that is when we say that it's considered edible and it has an obligation for Shumas and Maisris. Now, the translation of Agassim, they translate as pears, and they bring down here from Tiferes Yisrael, our pears today do not grow with this covering, with this fuzzy covering. The Mishnah is discussing certain varieties of pears that do have such a covering. Okay, just interesting point. Ha-tilsa mishetetzameach. Tilsan is fenugreek. Fenugreek becomes obligated once it sprouts. Once it sprouts means that the seeds come to a point, the seeds of the fenugreek come to a point that if you plant them, they would grow. And how do you know that? So the Bartanur brings down, the way we know that is that if you take these fenugreek seeds and you put them into the water, and the majority of it sinks into the water, it doesn't completely sink into the water, but the majority of it sinks into the water, then you know that these seeds could be planted in and they would sprout themselves. Once you get to that point, that's the point by fenugreek that we know that it's considered edible and it's liable for maisris. It's obligated to maisris. Ha-tavua v'ha-zeisim mishachnisu shlish. When we are talking about any type of grain or olives, when they grow a third of their full size, that is when we consider them edible. So that's the last part of the Mishnah. Whether we're talking about grain or olives, when they grow to a third of their full size, that's when they're considered edible, and that's when they are obligated in Shumas and Maisris. Prohibition against basically separating things out of order. We know there's a number of things we have to separate from our grain, the new grain, Shumas and Maisris, Bikurim, all these different things we've discussed. And there's an order to it. And the Torah forbids us to go out of order. Doesn't mean it doesn't work, but there's a prohibition against going out of order. Shadama, as it states, your offerings from dry and liquid yields you shall not delay. Don't delay something that's supposed to be coming earlier. And the order is like this. The first thing that you separate are bikurim. Bikurim are the separation of some of the first ripening fruits that we have to take to Yerushalayim and then give it to a Kohen. So the first thing that's separated is bikurim. Bizman shenoig, when bikurim applied, when it was relevant. V'achakach mafresh shuma. What's left after that, you separate shuma from it. That's what you, the person who owns this grain, is going to have to give to the Kohen. After that, from what's left over, you separate the Ma'aser the first tenth, which goes to the Levi. And after that, you separate from what's left over the Ma'aser Sheni, the second Ma'aser, which is the Ma'aser that we refer to, that's how we refer to the Ma'aser, that it's yours for consuming. But it's sanctified, it has to be in Yerushalayim or redeemed onto money, and the money is taken to you spent in Yerushalayim. Ayani. Or it's talking about the other years when the second tenth, instead of going to you and being sanctified in Yerushalayim, you have to give it to the poor. Have a wonderful day.